Mongols, yay, nay, good rulers, bad rulers, medium rulers. Were they good sometimes, bad other times? Sure. As I almost just dropped my guitar. Oops. Ruled and conquered territories. By the way, this is recorded, but you won't pop up if you don't make noise. And I do thank the people who do have their cameras on. You guys rock. All right, so remember, as we talked about, when Eli the Mongol knocks on your castle gate, you have two options. You can resist and probably be massacred, meaning completely killed, or you could surrender and hopefully have survived. I'm glad you already have it written down. You must have looked on the website or something. Because my other class we hadn't done this, and I think we already we did everything from there. Okay, but like I said, if you surrendered, things were typically good for you. The Mongols, they were considered positive because first off, if we have like Governor Celeste in charge of the city, and Celeste hadn't kicked off the Mongols, Celeste will probably still stay the governor of the city. They'll keep her there because she's local, she knows how the city works, and they know she'll do a good job. So typically, you are left still in control of yourself. You know, Xiane ruled her city, and she still gets to rule her city unless she ticked off the Mongols. One thing that was considered very positive is the Mongols didn't really care at all about religion. We just got finished talking about the Abbasid Caliphate, which some of their land was captured by the Mongols, and under the Abbasids, and very much so under the Khwarezmi tribe that we talked about Genghis Khan annihilating last week. Typically, those places you either had to follow Islam, or you at least paid an additional tax if you did not follow Islam. The Abbasids were nice, and they said, "Well, you just pay an extra tax; you can't get all the good jobs." Where the Khwarezmi, it was you have to be Muslim or else. Other places were like, hey, you need to be this religion or else, or you have to pay these extra taxes. The Mongols didn't care. The Mongols said you could be whatever religion you want. It doesn't matter to us. And what was interesting is the Mongols, we talked about this briefly, they're going to wind up basically adopting whatever religion of the conquered areas they are. So in China, they became predominantly Buddhists. In the Russian Golden Khanate, they became predominantly Christian. And under the Il Khanate, they become primarily Muslim because that's what the people were. And people who had been abused by other groups because they were a minority, meaning there were less of them than the others, the Mongols didn't care. The Mongols, they just took everybody for who they were, which is something really quite progressive and really quite refreshing because in this time period, everybody was picking out reasons to tax and or kill other people. And the Mongols, they killed equally, and they also gave rights equally. And one of the other cool things about the Mongols was that government corruption was much less. It was more rare during the Mongolian rule because governments often wind up having people who take money or help their friends and not think about the people as a whole. So we see that the Mongols are going to wind up going and cutting down on government corruption, meaning government not doing their job, not doing the right things. Because basically, just like the Mongols with everything, the penalty was execution if you were being corrupt. So we see generally better rule, sometimes less taxes, and often more freedoms under Mongolian rule than rules from others. But I mean, the cost, of course, was so many millions of people were killed. Now let's go look at how they ruled China, because we're going to see it's actually going to be in stark contrast, which is kind of a bummer. So we have Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan is going to be really probably the most famous of the Mongol Khans, with the exception of, his grandfather, Chinggis. So he is Chinggis's grandson, which isn't unique. We know that Genghis had a lot of kids and then a lot of grandkids. But he's going to become the great Khan, as he will wind up being the Mongolian who conquers China. That's something that Chinggis Khan was unable to do. Chinggis, or if you remember Genghis, whatever you want to know him as, I just want to make sure you guys know that it's the same guy. He couldn't conquer all of China. He conquers northern China. He causes the Sung dynasty to move to southern China because he destroys everything in the north and takes it over. And the Mongols, so they're going to be ruling China from a relatively early time, but never all of it. And it was one of those things that the Mongols aspired to conquer China, and they just couldn't do it until we have Kublai going and doing it. And Kublai, instead of going and taking over China and saying, you are part of the Mongolian Empire, he goes, I'm emperor of the Chinese Empire. So he goes and takes the role of Chinese emperor as opposed to being Mongolian Khan, which is pretty interesting. He goes and calls himself emperor. He calls his dynasty the Yuan dynasty. He starts doing something crazy, guys. You're not going to believe it. He starts taking baths all the time like the Chinese would. I mean, how weird is that? Like, instead of wearing his regular smelly, like, Mongol, like, mouse skin sewn together clothes, he started wearing Chinese silks. He stopped going and, like, doing all the crazy Mongolian activities, like drinking that fermented mare's milk, and started drinking Chinese wine. He started going and, he took Chinese wives. His children, they went to school and were taught. I mean, what kind of barbarian is he now, going and doing all these crazy things, right? That's what the Mongols thought. The Mongols would make fun of him. They're like, what's wrong with you taking all these baths, wearing those fancy clothes, wearing jewelry and being all fancy and, going and sitting on like a Chinese, throne and all this. So the Mongols, a lot of them didn't like how Kublai was acting Chinese. They saw, you're no longer Mongolian, you're Chinese. When that's kind of funny because, like, the Mongolians basically always took on whatever culture they were in. And this happens in 1279. But we're going to see something really weird. Kublai clearly respected Chinese culture. He clearly liked Chinese culture because he acts like a Chinese emperor. He has his children grow up to be like Chinese princes as opposed to like Mongolian style. However, they are horrible to the southern Chinese. Horrible. They have soldiers along the streets making sure that every rule is followed. And if not, severe beatings or execution happens. We have almost all of the Chinese wealth is taken from the Chinese and given to the Mongols. So the cities wind up becoming very rich areas, and as they would be, but mostly it's Mongols being rich or non-Chinese foreigners, not necessarily being Mongols, but Persians, Arabs, Africans, Europeans becoming very wealthy and powerful in China, whereas the Chinese themselves were kept out of power, kept away from wealth. And we're going to see that the Chinese people that live in the countryside are going to be extremely poor. So it's going to be very weird how clearly the Mongols respected Chinese culture. They liked acting Chinese, but the way they treated the actual Chinese people was horrendous. None of those freedoms that we talked about on the previous slide were given to the Chinese. So, for example, a Mongolian merchant or a European or Arab merchant, they could go wherever they wanted in China and trade anything they want and pay no tax. If you were, Mongol or blah, blah, blah. If you were Chinese, however, you could only trade certain locations, certain items, and pay heavy taxes. So it was a very unfair system, and it's very weird because it's unlike unlike the other places that the Mongols ruled. So the southern Chinese were abused and mistreated a great deal. They also treated Korea the same way. They kind of saw Korea as an extension of China, which is kind of silly because Korea has a very unique history and different culture. And we'll talk more about Korean history in the spring, which kind of excites me because I really like Korea and particularly Korean food. Korean barbecue, it's amazing. And kimchi, oh, so good. But anyways, why do I talk about Korea? Well, it's going to have a lot to do with the Mongol invasion of Japan. So the Koreans are essentially enslaved into creating a navy for the Mongols and then having to man the ships. They create this humongous navy, not once but twice, and they put all of these Mongolian soldiers on these ships. This happens in 1274 and 1281. And they go and attack Japan. And it's looking bad. The Mongolian army, So many Mongols, only a few Japanese samurai. What is going to happen? Well, a typhoon happens. A typhoon is what we would call a hurricane. It's kind of weird. If it's in the Atlantic Ocean, it's a hurricane. If it's in the Pacific Ocean, it's a typhoon. And if it's in the Indian Ocean, it's a cyclone. Why it has a different name for each ocean, I have no idea. What it would be called in the Arctic Ocean or Southern Ocean, I have no idea either. Probably nothing because they don't happen there or no one cares to pay attention. But this huge tropical storm comes and destroys the first Mongolian fleet, wipes them out. So the Mongol invasion of Japan never happens the first time. So 1281, 7 years later, the Mongols try again. They force the Koreans to build a huge navy for them. They load up on their ships. They get some of the soldiers ashore, and the Japanese samurai and the Mongols fight. And it's not good for Japan. Japan is probably going to lose this fight, even though we consider the samurai some of the greatest warriors ever. The Mongols decide to move their fleet, though, and a lot of their soldiers. And once again, a typhoon happens, destroys the Mongolian fleet. And this was called the kamikaze. When we talk about Japan later this year, which I'm also extremely excited about, we're going to talk about Shintoism, the native religion of Japan. And they believe in this idea of the kami, which are spirits. Important people like the emperor, of course, he has a kami. The stream has a kami. The mountains, the wind, all have this spirit, the kami. And so the divine wind, or kamikaze as it's known now, comes and destroys those Mongolian fleet not once but twice. It saves Japan from the Mongols. The unstoppable force that could not be beaten was stopped by a storm. And this is actually going to be really interesting because this is going to change the Japanese psyche. We're not there yet. We're going to talk about this sort of thing when we get to Japan later on in the year. But this is going to give the Japanese a feeling of invincibility. And it's going to be something that's going to last with the Japanese until 1945. That's right. So until, 600 years, until the end of World War II, the Japanese have this idea that, the kamikaze, the spirits will save them. So they have this idea that, they can get away and do anything. And so part of the reason why we see this industrial and aggressive Japan in modern times that leads up to World War II, it's part of this idea that nothing could touch them anyways. And you guys are probably, some of you are familiar with the term kamikaze because those were the pilots of the Japanese that would crash their planes loaded with fuel and bombs into American ships. This idea that they'll be saved by the divine wind. Well, it didn't, but that's another story for another day. But I wanted you to see how the Mongols treated those that they ruled, and also just get a little taste of one time when the Mongols actually lost. So that's our notes for the day. I'm stopping the recording. Do we have any questions from anyone?